Forging cybersecurity experts. SecureNinja.
Well, hello everyone. Hello and welcome to SecureNinja's webinar. Today we're doing security analytics skills, listening in on today's tactics, techniques and procedures, also known as TPPs. We're very pleased to have you with us. I'm Andrew Howard and I am an instructor here at SecureNinja. But before we begin, I'd like to take just a very brief moment to speak about SecureNinja for those of us joining who aren't familiar with SecureNinja. So SecureNinja is a leader in IT training and certification exam preparation boot camps. We have been in business since 2004, and while we are based in Washington, D.C., we have classrooms on both coasts of the USA, and we also deliver all of our classes online as well, becoming more and more popular. We can also deliver private training boot camps at your organization anywhere in the world, and we do that all the time, guys. We invite all of you watching this webinar to consider SecureNinja for your next certification training. And we are offering a 30% discount on any of our CompTIA training courses for the next 30 days. You need to mention this webinar when you're inquiring with our sales team, and you'll immediately qualify for that 30% discount, any of the courses. You can find all of our courses at our website, SecureNinja.com. Okay, well, it's time for our presentation. But everyone, please stay with us until the very end, because we will be giving away a free CompTIA exam voucher to 2 webinar attendees, 2 people watching us live. You have to stay till the very end. The voucher can be used as payment for any single CompTIA exam. So if you've got your Security Plus, for instance, and you want to get your CAS Plus, or you want to do Linux Plus, anything at all, you can use that voucher. Now, I would like to introduce you to our very good friend and our special guest, and no stranger to the show, Dr. James Stanger. Hello, James. How are you?
Yeah, doing great. How are you doing?
Doing excellent. Excellent, James. So I'm going to talk about you a little bit, James, and find out what's going on. James is CompTIA's Chief Technology Evangelist. He works with IT professionals, hiring managers, and executives worldwide to identify critical skills and help build CompTIA's education programs. James has his finger on the pulse. His areas of expertise include security analytics, pen testing, Linux, open source, network administration and monitoring, blockchain and endpoint host support, EDR. Yeah. He has provided consulting concerning the business of risk management, as well as network architecting. On top of that, he has published dozens, nay, I say scores of articles, books, and blogs. His books have been translated into over a dozen languages. So, James, where are you joining us from today, and where have you been recently?
You know, I'm joining here from home. I'm from Olympia, Washington. For those of you who don't know where that is, just Seattle, Washington, on the west coast of the U.S. So good to be here. And I've been home, let's see, about a week. A little less. I was in the UK for a couple of weeks. I was attending, presenting at a show called the Service Desk Show. They call it SITS. And so that's about my 5th year in a row, I think, maybe 6th, which was fun. The last couple of years were all virtual, but this time I was able to get over to the UK, so that was terrific. And then I was able to spend, while I was over there, I took some time off, and I was able to walk the area of Penzance. If you've ever heard of the Pirates of Penzance, right, that play, I was right there, and it was really fun. Or if you've ever heard of Land's End, it's the westernmost, did I get that right? Westernmost point of England. And Cornwall is interesting because it's they kind of consider themselves kind of their own country, as it were, in some ways. You know, so it's a lot of fun.
Cool. Well, listen, James, welcome to SecureNinja. We'd like to get on with the webinar. Sure. The floor is yours. Take it away. TPPs. Tell us what you know.
Okay, sounds like a plan. I've got a slide deck I'd like to show. If I could see if I can share my screen. There she blows. And so let's see. I will show a screen. Let's see which one. That there is Logans Rock in the UK. It's called Logans Rock. because there was a gentleman who accidentally, on purpose, knocked it off, and they had to put it back. It took like 30,000 pounds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in like 1860 when it happened, that was a lot of money. Maybe it was 1880. Shows you how good I am at history these days. But today, folks, we're going to talk about security analytics skills. Now, last time, if anybody remembers, we talked about pen testing, right? So that was the red team. This is the blue team, okay? In other words, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. And so today, I'm going to be talking about what it means to listen in on attacks, okay, and things like that. A lot of principles, and these are principles that you can learn. For example, it's using the CompTIA CySA certification, Cybersecurity Analyst Plus certification. So we're going to be talking about some of the principles behind here, what some of the techniques are. Thanks so much for the introduction, man. I appreciate it. I'm the Chief Technology Evangelist. I've done a lot of work in education. For example, I've been involved in the creation of certifications and badges and things for years. Certifications for Linux, for web technologies like scripting languages, things like that. Databases for Linux and for security analytics, for example, pen testing, been involved in the creation of programs for that. That's because I've done work as a web developer. I've done work as a pen tester, as a security analyst. So, and I even did a certification, they call it a badge, a merit badge for the Boy Scouts of America, their kayaking merit badge. I was involved in the creation of that merit badge. That was cool. And even for a program in British Romantic literature of all that. That's where I got my PhD in. But anyway, so I have been working in the tech space for many years now. And so it's going to be fun, I think, to talk to you today about security analytics. If you've never heard of CompTIA, it's not CompTIA or CompTIA or anything like that. We're an education company. We're an IT trade association. We work with corporations, very large, very small. And we work with them, and they tell us kind of what to do. And we work with them, for example, to create programs. Anybody here A+ certified? Look at the chat here. If anybody has any comments, by the way, please put them into the chat window, and I will listen to them very carefully. For example, open up the chat window if you can, and let me know what where you're calling in from. Again, I'm calling in from Seattle. Really Olympia, Washington, and tell me where you're calling in from. Let's see, so type it in here, greetings from Olympia, Washington. So CompTIA is based out of Chicago, but we have offices around the world, and we listen very carefully what the industry tells us to do. And that's one reason why we created the CySA Plus certification and why we've gotten into security analytics. So today, folks, we're going to talk about what organizations are looking for, okay? We're going to talk about what it means to do security analytics. And I'll be showing you a little bit about Security Onion, for example. It's a Linux operating system that has all sorts of fun tools in it. If you've ever heard of Kali Linux before, Kali Linux is for pen testing, you could argue. I create my own Linux system with the tools that I want to use, but Kali Linux system is kind of the poster child for pen testing. Well, Security Onion, you could argue, is the poster child for security analytics, for the blue teaming. So we're going to talk a bit about that. Kind of what indicators of compromise look like for various things and various attacks. So shall we go ahead and move forward? If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat window, or you can put them in the Q&A window, and folks at SecureNinja will send me the questions on over. So what are organizations looking for? I asked that question here, and that's a screenshot I took, I think, while I was in San Francisco in a highly caffeinated environment. I don't drink coffee. That's why the coffee maker there is empty. But I'm afraid I do drink a lot of Diet Cokes, and I had those ready to go. That's me working with Group Captain Amorn, who lives in Thailand. He works and leads the Thai NCSA, the NCSA basically being the people responsible for organizing incident response for the country of Thailand. And I'm lucky enough to talk to a lot of folks, for example, like Group Captain Amorn, for example, or the CISO of the state of New Jersey, Mike Garrity, for example, or the CISOs of Zscaler, for various organizations. And I've asked them, many times, what do you guys tend to look for? And what they're not asking for is this, okay? Has anybody ever seen this before in security? The CIA Triad, and there's, I guess, nothing wrong with that, but it's an old concept of, with encryption, you get confidentiality, availability, and integrity, the CIA Triad. And that's kind of an old way of looking at things, and it's fine. But for security analytics, that's not a model that's particularly useful. For security analytics, I was asking people, and they basically come up with 3 words. They want people who can curate content. And that doesn't mean people who, create web blogs or anything like that. That's another form of curation. It's a perfectly legit one, but not much to do with security. But they need people who can take data, random data, and then show trends. Okay, that's what I mean by curation. And they don't need people who collect data. It's pretty easy to collect random data. And by random data, folks, I'm talking about, for example, log files or data feeds, okay? And by data feeds, I'm talking about these days, if you're using a cloud implementation, you're not doing so much of putting intrusion detection systems necessarily on those systems. You can, but you're really collecting information, data, log files, and feeds from those cloud resources. And when I say cloud resources, that could be virtual machines, sure. You launch a Windows or a Linux virtual machine. It could be serverless applications, okay, there's that. But the whole idea is to get all of that data and then process it into information. Easier said than done. And we're going to talk about some of the ways to do that. And then the idea of assurance. And by assurance, I'm talking about corporations these days. The reason why they are sometimes hesitant to hire the right people is because they just can't come to any sense of confidence that people have the curation skills and the ability to turn data into information. That's why I'm here today, to entice you into becoming a security professional who can do those very things. Is it easy to do? Not easy to do. It's certainly doable if you apply yourself. So I'm going to talk today about the skills that will make it possible for you to do what I'm semi-jokingly, a little facetiously calling the new CIA Triad, okay? To give people confidence by giving them curated content. And I'm going to talk to you today about how some of that's done. To get a little deeper into this thing, it's all about monitoring, visualization, and observability. Fancy terms. But what I mean by monitoring is this. We did a survey not too long ago asking people who are hiring managers, what are some of the top skills that you're hiring for? And you'll notice there's more than one thing here listed, right? Quite a few. At the top is security monitoring. That's why I've highlighted it in red. Look at the second one. It talks about incident detection and response. You could argue that incident detection and response is very closely related, if not a subset of security monitoring. Why? Well, if you're not security monitoring, you ain't going to detect anything. Okay, and if you can't detect anything, there's no way to respond to it. So you'll notice the first 2 top things that were listed have to do really with monitoring. Now there are some additional skills here, but if you have good monitoring ability, that means you can keep up business continuity. And about this time in any presentation, there's always some mention of some previous hack that had happened. So fill in the blank there with whatever entity has gotten hacked. There have been so many. But I would argue that if we're talking about stopping zero-day attacks, and a 0-day attack is what? One that there is no known fix for. In fact, nobody even knows it's happened. So there is no signature that goes into a snort database, right? Into a snort signature database. There's no signature that could go into an antivirus, anti-ransomware database, right? We need people who can monitor and look for goofy things, okay? And don't worry, I'll explain what goofy things means in a second, okay? But I just want to paint this picture because if we're going to do threat modeling, look at the bottom of this particular bar chart, if we're going to understand threat intelligence, then you have to understand what you're monitoring in the first place. And the answer for that is TTPs. That's a little teaser. No pun intended, get it? TTPs, teaser, sorry. But we're going to talk about the techniques, the techniques and the procedures and the tools that are used to take to listen for the techniques, tools, and procedures that attackers use. That's really important to understand because it's not necessarily forensics. A lot of people feel that if they're going to get into security, it's all about forensics, and people will use the term forensics to talk about monitoring. In my mind, the way I was raised in security, forensics has to do with the concept of how should I put this? If there's some bad guy that did something bad with a particular box, whether they be the little teensy box of a mobile phone or their computer, then a police person will come along and she'll take that box, right, bag it and tag it, and then they'll do forensic analysis of that box to look for some sort of indicator of a crime, right? Seriously related to the idea of monitoring and visibility, but the idea of if you want to become a police person and do that sort of thing, great. But the kind of forensics I'm talking about really has to do with more monitoring. And you're taking a look as a security operations specialist in some sort of security operations center. That could be a center that you walk into. It could be a center that is virtual, where you are working in your home with a group of people engaging in monitoring. I know a gentleman, for example, Eli. And Eli worked for about 1.5 years as a junior security analyst for a healthcare company in the Utah, Salt Lake City area in the United States. And he worked for about 1.5 years looking through log files and data feeds to basically look for a lot of denial of service attacks. They were finding that this particular organization, for whatever reason, was the victim of constant distributed denial of service attacks. They were a healthcare organization, ran 2 or 3 hospitals, a lot of clinics, a lot of data processing utilities and applications, processing things like bloods and fluids and things like that to see, to help people get better, right? That was his job. That was so he didn't go and bag and tag boxes and go through forensics. He basically was looking at log files and looking for issues. He would see something that he was trained to say that's an issue, and then he would send that up to a senior analyst who would then recommend some form of solution. The reason I'm talking about this is that we need more of these kinds of junior and senior level analysts. I hear talk about people will say, well, those jobs, some of those jobs are being automated away. And that's a phrase, I've automated away, that I've been hearing for decades, that web development jobs will be automated away and security jobs will be automated away, or IT jobs, certain skills will be automated. And that's generally not a bad thing. If you've been kind of lazy, and I'll put that bluntly, it's probably too bluntly, and you have not progressed in your skills, you can get automated away. Most anybody can. And it won't be AI that automates you. It'd be more like a web script that'll automate you more than anything else. If you've at all kept pace with the skill sets having to do with monitoring, chances are you will be working with AI all of the time. Just the other day, I was using an application and some AI was recommending a solution that was very correct. And not only did I adopt that solution, but then I found ways to automate it and orchestrate it so that it could go and solve that problem every time it saw it. You still need a human being to review a lot of that AI. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. They haven't removed humans from the loop yet, right? Might be coming, but not for years. So I've been talking a lot here. I want a little bit of participation if we can. What do you see in the middle of this picture? This has to do with my point about automating. Excuse me, not about automating, my point about, how should I put it? About monitoring. Okay, so take a look at this picture. What do you see in the middle of this screen? And I'm not seeing anybody in the chat right now. Could be that I only can see chat from the, let's see, there we go, from everybody. There we go, maybe I can see that. But I'm curious what you see there, because you should see, and that's a picture I took in the, where was I? In the Teton National Park. And that is of a grizzly bear. Okay, do you see in the middle there, that picture? There's a grizzly bear. I was hiking along with my family and I looked over and there she was. Her cubs were fairly nearby. And like a fool, instead of running away from that, you could say threat actor, right? Hard to say who the threat actor was here, because I started running towards her because I wanted to get a better picture and I just thought it was fascinating. And what I noticed as I got closer to her, she was stripping the bark off of these dead trees. Do you see there's a standing dead tree there, and then there's one that's lying down. She was eating the bugs that were inside of the bark there, right? Bears eat anything. The reason I bring this up is that I think it's kind of a fun little analogy. Here we have a threat actor in a series of hosts, right? You could argue even a server farm type of thing. You have a hacker, as it were, living off the bugs of distressed resources. That's what hackers do. And as a hiker, my job was to look for indicators of attack or indicators of compromise or some sort of threat anomaly, right? And then act appropriately. Unfortunately, I didn't act appropriately. I started running towards her, taking pictures, and she kind of started looking up there, and then I turned around very quickly and walked back where I belonged. And all was well, thankfully. She wasn't hurt, and neither was I. The reason I bring up this is because that's your job as a security monitor, right? Well, you do more than that, though. You look for patterns, and you do pattern recognition. And here is another picture I'd like you to take a look at, because you're looking at what Pacific Northwesterners like myself will call RASH, R-A-S-H. And that's because in the foreground there, you're looking at that big mountain, that big volcano, that's Rainier. There's your R. All right, to the left in the picture is Mount Adams, that's the A. To the, that was the left, sorry, yeah. To the right of Mount Rainier, you can kind of see it there. That's Mount St. Helens, right? So there's the S, right, St. Helens. That is the one that blew up back in 1980. I've actually climbed that one. And then in the very back, if you could barely see that beautiful conical, it's in the shadow there, that's Mount Hood, that's the H, R-A-S-H. If you're a Pacific Northwesterner and you're lucky enough to be flying on a day where it's not overcast, good luck with that in general, you can see this on a plane. And I was lucky enough to grab a picture of that. That's a pattern that mostly Pacific Northwesterners call RASH, that only they know. But the whole job here of a security analyst is to look for patterns and come up with some sort of narrative. I may have bored you with that narrative, but it's the idea, instead of saying, well, there's an attack here and there's an attack or whatever, it's all about coming up with patterns, okay, and identifiable ones and useful ones. I think most of us have heard from a security analytics perspective or an attack perspective of various models. There's so many of them out there, and they're all valid. There's no one that's more current than the other, I believe. They just have to do with their relevance to a particular situation. What you're looking at is the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. That's the official name. So I didn't come up with these terms. These terms were come up with years ago. And they're still quite relevant because they basically describe, from either a red team attacker perspective or a blue team perspective, what it means to do an attack. So you do reconnaissance. If you've ever heard of OSINT, right? Open source intelligence, that's part of reconnaissance. Nmap, things like that can be used. Shodan, okay, all of these things can be used for reconnaissance. And then if you find some sort of weakness, then you basically go, well, what kind of code can I create or obtain to take advantage of any weakness that I see, and how do I deliver that in the best possible way? So you can talk about various types of tools for distributed denial of service attack, maybe, or ransomware, or something very subtle like an advanced persistent threat that isn't, hopefully, from a hacker's perspective, not easily found. And then you find ways to deliver it. Usually these days through social engineering, right? That's if you can't get past all of the monitoring tools very easily, then get somebody internal to do it for you, trick them into it. And then you exploit that vulnerability. You install additional functionality, persistence, lateral movement, to issue commands so that you can take control of a network, of a resource, of particular botnets, etc. And then do what you intended to do as an attacker. So from a blue team listening perspective, we try to look for the indicators of compromise and the tools and the techniques and the pivot points that are behind all of this. There's another model out there, the MITRE ATT&CK model. Perfectly legitimate, fantastic model. Notice it talks about initial recon, okay? It doesn't use the word discovery or whatever, it uses recon. And then what initial compromise is there? What kind of foothold is there? You see, it's very related. The two are very similar. I like this model a lot because attackers do that kind of initial recon and the initial compromise, and they establish footholds. And then there's kind of a circular, I'll call it a heuristic, kind of situation where you will maintain your presence. For example, if I go in on a buffer overflow of a particular application, and I get a root prompt on a Linux system, or I'm able to get a command prompt on a Windows system, that's great. I'm in there, but those are very precious and fleeting kinds of victories. You need to maintain your presence later. So once you get that, then you create a user, or you escalate a simple user up to an administrator user. You enable RDP, remote desktop protocol, or some sort of way to get back in. And that way that you enable to get back in should be subtle on some level. And you complete your mission. So there's all sorts of models out there. This is a model here that a lot of artificial intelligence tools use. It's the idea of mapping the victim's infrastructure and what that person is doing, or what that network or business is doing, with the capability of the adversary. And the idea is to basically identify the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that allow, excuse me, attackers to pivot. And the term pivot, and by the way, TTPs, that's a concept that was stolen effectively by the cybersecurity industry from the anti-terrorist folks, right? Because terrorists look for the techniques, the tactics, and the procedures of attackers, whatever terrorists you can think of in the world. And so the idea is to see what kind of pivoting happens. Pivot means a decision that's made and then the behavior associated with that decision. Okay, so what does that have to do with Port Kernel, a beautiful beach that you're basically looking at there? Well, it actually does. So let me talk to you about security analytics and Port Kernel, UK, because Port Kernel is a really cool little place that has beautiful beaches. It's in the southwest of England. It's where the Pirates of Penzance used to hang out. If you've ever heard of that, you could Google that. It was turned into a play, but there were a lot of pirates that hung out here. But it's also where, traditionally, since before World War II, since even during World War I, the entire communications apparatus of the UK is. And I'm not talking about just necessarily lighthouses or cool places where I was able to walk to. Sometime I'll tell you about this beach. It took me a lot to get to that beach. But as I was walking, I noticed there were all sorts of indicators of infrastructure running around here. And if you could read that particular, resize your screen, this is basically where the National Trust is saying on this spot how's the end of a submarine cable, right? That came in the 1880s and was one of the first telegraphs, right? That came from the United States, that connected the UK to Paris and to India, to Africa, and the world. And in fact, there's a museum there that I was walking. I didn't realize quite what I was walking into. I'd heard about this. But I noticed that there is now a museum, but that used to be the communications hub for the entire UK all the way through after World War II, and still to this day, there's a lot of global communications that goes through this area. In fact, I even found a cable there just right out in the open. I doubt that cable is in use today, but it's a holdover from what was going on. And while I was studying this and learning about this, it was interesting because it was a very small little village. I mean, we're talking probably 50 people lived in that village during World War II. I think about the same number it does now. But they had a huge number of military people move in there because they wanted to protect those lines of communication. Why? Because German E-boats and U-boats would go in and try to slice in and splice into these cables and listen in and discover things. So they hired a lot of then security analysts to listen in to see if the Germans were cutting into their lines and things like that. Today, we have a lot more sophisticated job roles and things like that, you could argue. But they do much the same sort of thing. We have security analysts and we have threat hunters. A security analyst, either a junior or a senior one, listens for attacks. They listen for issues. They identify indicators of an attack and indicators of compromise. I'll explain that in just a sec. And they have very good understanding of the network, and they have great communication skills because they have to turn around and say, we think we see a problem. Let me explain why I think it's a problem. And then senior people can then make decisions. A threat hunter is really a more senior role. It is very associated with security analytics, but it's a combination of pen testing and security analytics. This person will assume that the network is already compromised. So whereas a security analyst looks for compromises and just kind of sees that there might be a problem. A threat hunter already assumes that there's a problem and conducts a more aggressive analysis while still listening. So they're not pure pen testers, and that's a good thing. They're really somebody who has a sensitivity to both sides of it. And they do a lot of automation of resources and things like that. Well, what does it mean to do security analytics then? What does it mean to kind of analyze a situation? This was me taking a picture of a rock that I wanted to climb up to, and I just wanted to see what was the best way to approach it. And it's the same sort of thing that you're probably doing from a career perspective right now, but it's also something that a good security analyst does. They kind of get a good lay of the land and try to figure out what's going on. Well, one of the first things is you're going to understand, in one way or the other, Lockhart's exchange principle. Edmund Lockhart was a person who I think passed away right around the time I was born. And he basically made every crime novel, crime detective movie or TV show or series that you've ever heard of possible, okay? Because he taught basically and formalized the idea that a criminal will bring something to the crime scene and usually leave something behind. In fact, almost always. Using Lockhart's principles, they brought in the idea that fingerprints are something that are actually, unique. He didn't invent fingerprinting, but he invented the concept that allowed fingerprinting to be something used forensically. In cybersecurity, we use the same concepts. Like I said, we steal things constantly. Like the concept of firewall that was stolen by cybersecurity folks, either from the architecture industry, because a firewall will separate one building or one apartment complex from another, or from the automotive industry, right? They talk about a firewall that separates you from the engine compartment. If it catches on fire, it doesn't burn you up as quickly. So you bring something and then you leave something as a criminal, as it were. Well, this has to do with the concept of indicators of compromise. So if you leave something behind, there are various indicators that can happen. So if you focus on a particular resource, like a server or an endpoint, any sort of endpoint, that could be a server, that could be a router, it could be a mobile phone, etc., an IoT device. These days, there are a lot of operational technologies that we're looking for, indicators of compromise. Operational technologies meaning technologies that control pressure inside of a pipeline or a tank or something. When I say a tank, I mean a tank full of water or a tank full of some sort of chemical or something like that. And we look for essential resources, and then we ask ourselves, well, what can an attacker do to that? But more importantly, what does an attack actually look like? And it doesn't mean waging the attack. It actually means listening for the results of what an attack looks like. And so there's footprints, there's fingerprints, there's DNA, right, from a personal perspective. Well, from an indicator of attack perspective, on a cyber perspective, we're talking about all sorts of things that can be, all that stuff that could be left behind. So, for example, stuff left in memory. If there's an attacker that goes in and does something untoward or something illegal, something improper to a resource, generally they'll leave something behind. Text files deposited in a directory. Well, how did that text file get there? Very easily could be the result of some sort of tool that was used, either a custom tool that nobody knows about or something found in Metasploit, right? Which is a collection of tools that you'll see used. Usually they're pretty obvious and most people already know about them, but if you're new to security, Metasploit is kind of fun because you can see pre-baked, pre-cooked applications. But I've seen people, very hot shots, use Metasploit in very creative ways. Well, anyway, they always leave something behind, either in memory, deposited in a log file. If you cause something called a buffer overflow on a remote system, there's evidence of that. And good listening applications will look for those conditions. And they'll say, hey, there's something wrong. The network stack, the TCP/IP stack that makes communication possible, seems to have been disturbed in some sort of way. In the same way the forest was disturbed by either me walking through it or that grizzly bear walking through it, you can look for indicators of compromise and attack. There's a difference between compromise and attack. Attack means that there was an attack waged, but it didn't necessarily lead to an actual breach. So if there was some sort of actual breach left behind, buffer overflow, something, that would be an indicators of compromise. So you look for specific patterns. You can look for example, to associate an IP address with command and control infrastructure, that's C2 infrastructure. So the idea is that, well, okay, yeah, there's an IP address on the network we don't recognize, not necessarily a big deal, but what we're finding is that IP address, we can map it to some ports that are kind of odd, and we see traffic going back and forth. And that indicates to us that somebody is commanding something. Could be a commanding of a simple application, perfectly legit. Could be commanding some sort of application that might be part of a botnet. Okay, so you're talking about a botnet infrastructure, and you're discovering evidence of it being controlled to attack your network. So we're looking at all these types of things, and there's a good quote here on this eye chart of a slide, basically saying that TTPs describe how an adversary behaves, what they do, and indicators describe how to recognize what those actions might look like, and you'll find those in real time, usually after an attack, sometimes during. So this is what you look for, and again, indicator of attack is not necessarily a compromise. Indicator of compromise not only means increase in CPU usage, but unusual database patterns in a volume that is read-only. And if you see that additions have been made, that means somebody has gotten write access to that database, and that's evidence possibly of some sort of compromise. You could say that normally, if there's traffic between a web server and traffic between a SQL server, and you have normal size communications going on, but suddenly they become very large, that may mean that an attacker has been trying or actually succeeding in doing SQL injection attacks and things like that. So you can look for these kinds of issues. And this is, remember earlier I was talking about the new CIA Triad and talked about curation. So alerts and logs have never been enough. It results in too many false indicators. It results in too many false positives. False positives simply being, I think most of us know this, but the idea of that legitimate traffic is being tagged as bad. But oftentimes it just leads to too much information. You just get so much information, it's overwhelming, and you turn it off. And time again, we've seen organizations, whatever high-profile attack you can think of, where they turned off their intrusion detection, or they toned it down too much because they just were getting such information they didn't know what to do with it. That's because they didn't know how to curate content. They didn't know how to go in and fine-tune their tools, whether it be Security Onion, which is again a collection of security listening tools, or whatever tool they had. And the reason they don't do that is because too often you end up with a situation where an organization will buy something and then never properly implement it. So they'll buy a tool and say, hey, we got that, tick box, we're done. Well, no, you're not done. If you buy something, you usually have to find a way to integrate it and fine tune it. And that's part of curation. So you need kind of a blue team, red team dynamic so that you have the red team conduct an attack, and then you can see whether or not that tool that you bought or implemented, Security Onion's free, you don't just have to buy it, but that thing that you brought in, and have you fine-tuned it in such a way that it will discover what it needs to discover, and that it will leave alone what it doesn't need to discover. This process can take weeks, months, even longer, and oftentimes there is no completely finished here. So what I'm showing you here in this slide is the concept of curation. So you take evidence, you take tools, you take, how should I put it, log files from your host intrusion detection system, from your network intrusion detection system. That might be Snort, for example, or Waza, or you might take information from your IoT devices if you have a lot of those that are critical to your particular business function, whether you're a government or whether you're a corporation, doesn't really matter, at least at this level. If you're using applications and virtual machines and serverless apps in the cloud, you can take things like from CloudWatch, for example, I think that's AWS, or Sentinel, and then you bring that into a curation function. So notice there's this blue kind of square-ish type of thing. This is where you will use various types of tools and applications to basically churn, as it were, and process this information. A lot of times that's done automagically, right? But many times you'll have to fine-tune that yourself. And there are various tools out there that you'll see. One's called Beats. That basically is a file beat, and it's called file beat, and it listens for changes in activity, and it will help collect all of these different information resources. I would call those data sets. So there's a data set from the cloud, and data sets from intrusion detection, and data sets from IoT devices. And then you basically take that information, and using tools such as Elasticsearch, you can go up and Google that. They're a big company, very cool one. I've worked with those folks before. Logstash and even a tool called Curator to basically make that information searchable. And then you can visualize it. And what you're seeing there are a couple of screenshots of information that's been visualized. So to make it clear, what is Security Onion? Because I'm going to be showing you some of those elements there, some of these attacks inside of Security Onion. What Kali Linux is to pen testing, Security Onion is to security analytics. It coordinates various elements, that grabs data sets, that ingests information, and then it aggregates and collects it all together, makes it searchable, and then creates a nice visualized environment. And so you have to install that. And people will say, well, yeah, we don't use Security Onion. We're using, let's see, Splunk, for example, fantastic tool, or RSA Security Analytics, or any of the other dozens of fantastic tools that are out there. But I'm focusing on intrusion detection tools that are open source right now, because at CompTIA, we're really big on learning things in a hands-on way. And if you're lucky enough to be able to buy really expensive software, that's great. I don't have that kind of money, but I do have some time, and I do have the wherewithal to download some of these files and get them going and some of these things. And so I will use, for example, something called Zeek. Zeek used to be known as Bro. It's an intrusion detection tool. And I will use, so if you've ever heard of Snort, Zeek is like that. Some would argue possibly different, because Zeek, instead of using typical signatures, it actually can do that, but also look for kind of strange behavior. It has a very interesting engine that will look for odd behavior. So rather than saying, oh yeah, there's a buffer overflow caused by Eternal Blue, it will say, there's something going on with the stack that I think is funny. You ought to investigate it more. It kind of helps a little bit more with zero day attacks. There's Suricata, which is another intrusion detection tool. Elasticsearch makes information searchable. Logstash stores it. Kibana makes it viewable. FileBeat allows you to manage how all those logs are stored. In Kali Linux, you've got things like Metasploit, that is a collection of many tools, and the Beef browser that's really good at identifying conversations between various resources, a web server and an API, and then you can go in and manipulate that. Burp Suite does similar things. So, one's blue team, one's red team. And if you look at this particular screenshot, you're looking at a screenshot of a denial of service attack that I conducted myself. Okay, I didn't conduct it against anybody else. I had my own systems. In fact, I crashed the system because it was such a spike. And so in this case, it was a distributed one because I used multiple systems and controlled them, and I hit them just for a few seconds, and it generated 15,533 hits, okay, against one server. And then what I was able to do with that is, notice I was able to visualize that in a very crude way to help tell a story. This is what I mean by curation. So in this case, here's kind of the ugly log file that was generated. But what you can do is you can actually, instead of just saying, oh, hey, this ugly log file, a collection of log files tells me something, you're actually doing something a bit more than that, because you're listening and collecting, and you're storing and forwarding and doing data analytics. And this is part of that curation process. So here's a larger screenshot in case you couldn't see the one earlier. You'll notice that in this particular data set, it noticed 15,379 connection, attempts, or it wasn't attempts, they were successful. There was a little bit of about 76 alerts that were generated by the intrusion detection device based on that 15,000 and change connections. But also it noticed some issues with DHCP and DNS. These issues weren't necessarily something wrong with the configuration, but it noticed that this attack manipulated DHCP and DNS. DHCP spits out IP addresses, doesn't it? So basically, by grabbing DHCP addresses and exchanges, it was able to use that to conduct and amplify that attack many, many times. So you have 25 packets of DHCP that were then amplified to something like 15,000. It also manipulated DNS. The reason I explain this is because the DHCP server that I had and the DNS server that I had, as far as I could tell, were not vulnerable. They, as far as I could tell, they were not things that were manipulated because they were broken. They were manipulated because they were doing what they're supposed to do. And that's the problem with many of the attacks that we see today. It's kind of like COVID. COVID or any good, I shouldn't say good, but any successful virus takes advantage of a body's normal functioning. Okay, that's how they kind of survive. They sucker punch the body, right? In this case, you're looking at a visualization of a sucker punch, where an attacker, basically using the tools, techniques, and procedures of Kali Linux, I went and did this, and then using Security Onion, I went in and said, well, how did that work? What was the origin, or you could call it the root cause of that particular attack? And it was basically where I used some tools that manipulated DHCP and DNS's normal workings to create a flood of traffic. And so then you ask yourself, okay, as a security analyst, how can I stop that from happening in the future? And one of the answers is, well, my DNS servers, again, they were running just fine, but I hadn't segmented them. So what I could have done is I could have segmented a DNS server or two away from the network so they could do their proper job, but that once they send any flooding, that gets shut down. This is why you hear about, not just about indicators of compromise or TTPs, you hear about, well, what are the security controls? And so it's the job of a security analyst to go in and say, okay, I've identified what the issue is, and then you suggest a few good changes, a few common sense kinds of changes. So instead of looking at ugly log files, what you're doing is you're creating things like bar charts and pie charts. This is what I meant earlier about curation. Because what you're doing is you're basically trying to show your boss or bosses what they ought to do, or at least give them enough information to make some sort of educated and intelligent conclusion. And sometimes you'll even say, well, you know, what I have here doesn't really support any conclusions yet, but I'll find something, you know, we'll get to it. And you'll notice, let me go back just for a second, you'll notice there's a bar chart, right? You know, it just has bars showing kind of how it works. You could also visualize in pie charts if you feel that tells the story better. As a security analyst, you use tools, for example, and this is the Elastic search engine that I'm visualizing through Kibana. And what I'm showing you here is something called the Elastic Stack. It used to be called the ELK stack. Some people still call it that. The Elastic Stack, meaning you're using various tools together. By stack, I mean, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 tools kind of stacked together. So you log in to Kibana, which is kind of like a fancy web server. And that's what does the visualizing of the of what you found into a pie chart or into a bar chart or whatever. Elasticsearch is basically what makes the information searchable. It kind of collects it, and it takes a lot of the redundant, duplicated information, and kind of allows you to clean it up a little bit. And so all of this, you could say, well, that's done automatically, James. You know, just show me the login and away we go. Doesn't work that way. There's still manual processes that you have to do to get in to curate that content. And this allows you to identify, you know, look, not only do we see the flood of traffic, the connections there, but we're also seeing these other smaller indicators that are somehow related. And then you delve deeper into how those attacks work. So what you've kind of seen is a quick overview of what it means to curate content. Now let me show you some curation that has nothing to do really with security. What you're looking at here is something called the Titanic data set. It's called that because these are about 800 of the passengers, not all of them, that they've been able to identify that floated on the Titanic, well, and sunk on the Titanic. And what you can do is curate that data, and you can see it's just in a simple spreadsheet. In this case, an OpenOffice or LibreOffice spreadsheet. If you're probably used to using Excel, well, this is an open source spreadsheet reader. But I imported that data set into something called Jupyter Notebook. A lot of threat hunters if they use open source tools, will use Jupyter Notebook. Data analysts who have nothing to do with security will also use tools such as Jupyter Notebook, because what it does is it allows you to import a data set and then do things with that data set. And by do things, I mean to look for conclusions, to actually turn random data into actionable information. Because if you take a look real quick at this data set, there's more information in there hiding than you might realize, because it's not just people's names. It tells their sex, tells how old they are, tells you how much they paid for their fare, for their ticket, first class, second class, third class. It also shows you what cabin many of these people were in. So you can start looking and identifying information by saying, well, how many survivors were based on where they were staying in their cabin? If they were deep inside the ship, probably didn't make it in there, make it out of there very easily, or at all. If they paid more for their ticket, did they survive more? Well, many did. Women versus men, you could do things along the lines of race, class, gender, etc. So you can start teasing out information. And you're using, simple commands. In this case, I'm using very simple little Python commands, df.head, to read the head, the beginning, right, of the file. And you can do df.tail to read the end of the file. But after a while, you can do a little bit more sophisticated investigations to see, of the survivors, were they more men, were they more women, were they richer, were they poorer, how did that all work? What does that have to do with security? Well, you do much the same things, not in terms of race, class, and gender necessarily, but in terms of origin and relationship of one data set and one element of a data set to another. And you can do this. The reason I bring this up, and I'm running out of time, but the reason I bring this up is that I asked early on a bunch of security analysts and threat hunters, what was the killer tool that you use every day? And I expected them to use some fancy tool like something in SecureNinja or Kibana or some sort of fancy, really cool tool like Splunk or whatever. And they all said, spreadsheet. They spent a lot of time in spreadsheets, but also using other tools like Jupyter Notebook to identify trends, to see what kinds of origins to an attack. In this case, there's about 141,000 packets that were sent. And again, I was able to trace them back to DNS and DHCP issues on my network. You'll do more than just using spreadsheets and cool elastic stack things and security onion. You'll also use cybersecurity threat intelligence and wash that information through CTI. CTI is basically information sharing. There are a lot of organizations get attacked every day. I was talking fairly recently to two gentlemen from very large retailers, and I'm talking about Target and Amazon. And even though they're competitors, the security analytics workers share information between each other. Why? Because they know if somebody's attacking Target, chances are they're attacking Amazon. I've talked to banks, for example, who compete with each other all the time, but their security workers work with each other all the time. Because once again, if one bank's going to get attacked by some threat group, probably they're going after the other bank, and they help each other out. You use cybersecurity threat intelligence to get more context, to see what's going on. That allows you to really do a better job telling stories and coming out with proper information. So as you visualize information from data feeds and from captured traffic and things like that, you're taking those ugly log files and you're telling interesting stories, because your goal is to come up with actionable information. So when you hear about cybersecurity SIM tools, SIEM tools, you can Google that. Or automation and response, or a security operations center. What you're really hearing about is the results of people who implement host and network monitoring. And you're hearing the results of people who understand monitoring at the network level and at the host level. And people who are putting together all of these different elements, like I mentioned before, FileBeat and Logstash and Elasticsearch. And you're putting all these things together so that a security analyst can do his or her job. And you can do distributed curation, you can do standard curation, what have you. But the whole point between all of these deployments that you have is to help businesses move forward. So we have at CompTIA conducted a lot of research about the tools and the talent that you need to catch the bad guys or to help a business move forward. That's why we have the CompTIA pathways. There's various pathways, okay? There's a data pathway, there's the infrastructure pathway, there's our core skills, and of course, our cybersecurity pathway. And you need to enter where it makes sense for you. You might be somebody who's just changing, who's just investigating where I can go next. You might be somebody who's looking to move laterally or move up in the world. And you've been in a help desk and networking. You want to go into security, or you might want to go into cloud. But for security analytics, we have a cybersecurity pathway for you. If you want to become a threat hunter, Pen Test Plus, CySA Plus, CASP Plus, and of course, Security Plus. Where it makes sense for you to enter, right? Some people need to start learning about endpoints early on, then about how endpoints network with each other, etc. So there's a whole pathway. So if you want to learn more about this, if you live in the US, you can take a look at cyberstates.org. Pretty cool website that shows you the different cyber jobs that are available by region, by city, by town. You can go to cyber states if you're interested in an IT perspective and security perspective. You can drill right down into various states wherever you live. You can drill down and get all sorts of really useful information about the job needs in your particular area. Also, we have a series. It's called the IT Industry Outlook. The current one is 2022. The 2023 one will be coming out before you know it. But basically in here, we identify trends, and you can go back. You can go back and look at the 2021, the 2020, and see what's been happening. And you'll notice that data analytics is a very important part of the research that we do. And this is not just the opinion of a few people at CompTIA. We listen very carefully to thousands of people, our members. And we talk about the importance of proactive security and monitoring. That's why I'm talking to you today about CySA Plus. It's a major skill. It's a recognized skill. We don't have enough people who have those skills. So I'm going to go ahead and complete today's webinar, talk to you today about taking a look at, let's say, DDoS attacks and how you would listen in and visualize those using, in my case, I use Security Onion. There's dozens of other tools that you could use. But I just wanted to show you what that looked like and also explain to you the importance of monitoring, visualization, and some of the tools that are used to make that happen. If that interests you, I encourage you to check out the CompTIA Cybersecurity Pathways. That will make it possible for you to learn more. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close off my section of the webinar. I guess I can answer any questions that folks might have. I'm happy to do that.
So what we'd like to do is have people send in any questions. And whilst those are coming in, maybe we'll have time for 2 or 3 questions. I'll just mention a few things what I've taken out of this. But before we do, we have 2 winners. So 2 of the participants today have gained CompTIA vouchers. Nathan Williams and Harish Naknani, or Naknani. I beg your pardon if I'm mispronouncing your surname. But both of you, congratulations, you've got free exam vouchers. And John from SecureNinja will be in touch with you guys to get those sorted out with you. So great. Questions, send them in, please. Anyone who has questions. But here's what I took from it, James. It's very, very interesting. Very good presentation. Thank you very much. I learned a little bit there today. I really have.
If I can teach you, then I'm doing all right. So that's good.
No. We all come to this with a child's mind, right? We want to learn. Right? Nobody knows everything for sure. Specifically me. But I love what you said about indications of compromise versus indications of attack. That's something I've never really thought carefully about before. That was very interesting to me. So that's something to think about and how I teach my courses when I do teach CySA Plus. I want to make sure I emphasize that because you never know. That might be something interesting for someone taking an exam. Who knows? Absolutely. What else? Oh, I love what you said about organizations spend all this money on tools. I've seen it again and again in my professional life. We spend the big money, we bet the tools, but everyone is so busy. And it's a full-time job. Like I talk about this all the time. We have a SIEM system. It needs to be curated. There should be nothing red on that screen. If there's a red on that screen, everyone should be jumping up and down. But inevitably what we see in organizations, there's 5 reds, there's 15 oranges, and everyone's like, those are always there, you can ignore them. Right. No reds are ignored. If there's a red there, there's a problem. That should never be on the screen. People should be jumping up and down. And this is something I fought with and worked in my professional life to try and change that culture as well. That's always like that. That's not good enough, right? That's never, never good enough. It's a full-time job. We buy these tools, but we don't give the employees, you know, we're always looking for productivity. They need to be doing something that shows in statistics, but threat hunting, you know, it's invisible. What you get for the most part is invisible. You know, just giving people time to go looking for those threats, and you know, you don't often have an Easter egg at the end of it. But we still need to give people time to do that and to manage these very expensive tools. We need a human managing them. You've got to leave people the time to do that. What else did I see? Yeah, again, CTI, sticks and taxi, kind of reminded me of the diamond model when you're talking about information sharing, right? We were looking for attribution. Who are the attackers, right? Can we attribute the attacker to someone? And even though we are competitors in the field, it's the same bad guys attacking us all. So that is important to know, and I love that you brought that up. And we're not all enemies out there. We're actually sharing information with each other. And you know, I do like how CompTIA has the CySA Plus and the pen tests beside each other. They're not two different things. I always say, if you really want to be good at blue team, you have to understand how the attacker works.
Right.
I mean, they're just concepts otherwise, seeing logs, until you actually do just even some basic attacks, and it just opens up your world. You know, it's all very well talking about shell scripts. What is that? I don't know. Is it a peacock? I have no idea. Until you actually use one and you actually see yourself exploiting maybe a Windows or Linux machine, now it starts to really make sense what's going on. So yeah, very good. Any questions there, John? No, none extra have come in. So I think we're getting to the end. So congratulations to both Nathan and Harish. We will reach out to you. I would also like to remind everyone that we do still have some great deals on training for all of our certification courses. But if you're looking at getting a CompTIA certification soon, and why would you not? We have that 30% discount on all CompTIA courses just for you, only for the next 30 days, guys. So it's until June 25th, 2022. So with that, James, Abbas, as usual, an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for coming on and talking to us again. We'll hopefully see you at a conference or something. Hopefully we'll see you. We'll try to schedule something for about 2 months out and get another excellent course in. We're going to get this on YouTube. We're going to tag it for CySA Plus and all this kind of stuff, so people find it. Great advice, not just on examination, but in general, the mindset you need to be successful in this field. So I thought it was fascinating. So James, it's been. We'll talk to you again soon, and thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for attending, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All the best.
All the best.